Well, we are now continuing our series called 66 Books in 52 Weeks, and we are up to the book of 1 Samuel, which is the 9th book of the Bible, and we will go through this and just see what we can come up with and just get an overview of this. So first of all, let's just go to this overview chart here. Now again, this can be either purchased online. There's some links that you can go to for that, or we have these printed out, this graphic representation of how each of these books of the Bible go. So first of all, we see that it's the 9th book of the Bible. It's got 31 chapters in it, and it seems to have been written by Samuel, the prophet Nathan, Gad, and some other scribes as well. And we have here the book of 1 Samuel. It's the history of Israel. It begins with the birth of the prophet Samuel and ends with the biography of King Saul. And we see David in there as well. And so we'll go through this in just a little bit here in more detail. So here's the overview here. You see the way this chart has it here. It starts with the birth and the life of Samuel, who was the final judge of Israel before they started into kings. Saul becomes king. King Saul continues to reign while David is running from him, and Saul is trying to kill him. And then it ends with the death of King Saul. And so this is pretty much the outline there. So there's a key verse. Sometimes it's hard to come up with what the key verse of the whole book would be, but this is one that would be memorable from here. The verse would be, "But the Lord said to Samuel," and this is in the context of Samuel is seeking God's direction as to who is to be anointed as king after Saul. So that he goes to the house of Jesse, and the oldest brother's brought out. Samuel says, well, surely this must be the next king. But here is what God said. "But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." So that is one key verse you can take out of this. There's a lot of territory to cover through this, and so we'll try to get through this in the time we've got allotted here this evening here. So let's look here. There's 3 people that we're going to focus on in this book: Samuel, Saul, and David. So we're going to begin with Samuel, and that's chapters 1 through 8 of 1 Samuel. And this part here begins, the birth of Samuel is recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 1. And give you a little background here. There was a man by the name of Elkanah who had 2 wives, Hannah and Peninnah, easier for me to say, Peninnah. And so Peninnah had children, and Hannah had none. And Elkanah loved Hannah and favored her over his other wife. Again, yes, the Bible does contain examples of polygamy, multiple wives, but it always reads like a cautionary tale. It's always dysfunctional, and this is the case here. So Elkanah loved Hannah more than his other wife, and each year when they would travel to Shiloh, which was the place they would go where the tabernacle would be to offer sacrifices, Elkanah would give a double portion of all the leftover meat to Hannah. But Hannah was very much distressed because she could not have children, and her rival Peninnah she was provoked by her, and the other wife would make fun of her and try to guile her. And in 1 Samuel 1:11, here is Hannah, and she is making a vow to God and asking for God's help. She said, "Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head." Does anybody remember the type of vow that is called? It's the type that Samson had. Can you remember the name of it? It's a Nazarite vow. It's the Nazarite vow. So that's what that was. There's another example of it. So now the priest Eli, who served in Shiloh, thought that while Hannah was praying this prayer, he thought she was drunk because she was just so upset and distraught. But then he realized pretty quickly that she was just upset. And eventually Hannah's prayer was answered, and Samuel was born. After he was weaned, Hannah presented Samuel at Shiloh, he would serve the Lord there. And so she did. She dedicated him to the Lord. He served the Lord in this way all of his life. So then in chapter 2, you have Hannah's prophetic prayer. This was a prayer of thanksgiving that God gave her a son, but it does include a messianic prophecy. That is a prediction about Jesus. So she's exclaiming, giving praise to God, and she makes this statement in 1 Samuel 2:10. The Most High will thunder from heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. And that is believed to be a messianic prediction there, a prediction of Jesus. So you have birth of Samuel, Hannah's prophetic prayer, and then we learn a little bit about Eli's evil sons. 1 Samuel 2:12 through 36. Their names were Hophni and Phinehas. You don't hear a lot of people being named these days. So Hophni and Phinehas, Eli's son, they had no regard for the Lord. They took advantage of people who came to offer sacrifices. And at some point, an unknown prophet comes along and speaks against them and says this. A prophecy comes to them. I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who will do according to what is in my heart and mind. I will firmly establish his priestly house, and they will minister before my anointed one always. So, Hophni and Phinehas, judgment was declared on them. This was making way for Samuel to end up serving as the priest over Israel and as the judge over Israel. So, now Samuel is still a young man, and God calls him, and this is quite an interesting thing as well. 1 Samuel 3, and I'm going to read verses 1 through 5. The boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. So he was being trained by Eli. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. One night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the house of the Lord, where the ark was. Then the Lord called to Samuel. Samuel answered, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am. You called me?" But Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." So Samuel went back and lay down again. This happened again. Eli instructed Samuel to go back and respond. It's happened a couple more times, and Eli told Samuel to go back. Okay, if you hear this voice again, you respond, say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And so now I'm in 1 Samuel 3, down into verse 11. And the Lord said to Samuel, "See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears about it tingle. At that time I will carry out against Eli everything I spoke against his family from beginning to end. For I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about, his sons blaspheming God, and he failed to restrain them. Therefore I swore to the house of Eli, the guilt of Eli's house will never be atoned for by sacrifice or offering." So, Samuel gets this message from God. Now he has to get up and go talk to Eli. So the next morning, at Eli's insistence, Samuel repeated everything the Lord had said. He said, "Don't hold back, just tell me what the Lord said to you." And so in 1 Samuel 3:21, it's interesting. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, and there he revealed himself to Samuel through his word. So Samuel's beginning to be the spiritual leader in Israel here. God's raising up somebody else here now. So now we get to the point where there is judgment for Eli and his sons. So the Philistines come in to Shiloh and they capture the Ark of the Covenant. This is a horrible thing to happen in Israel. And they kill Hophni and Phinehas, Eli's two sons. Now a messenger comes back to relay the news to Eli. So listen to how this goes down. 1 Samuel 4:17 and 18. The man who brought the news replied, Israel fled before the Philistines, and the army has suffered heavy losses. Also, your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the Ark of God has been captured. So that's the news that Eli's gotten. Now notice what he says. When he mentioned the Ark of God, Eli fell backward off his chair by the side of the gate. His neck was broken and he died, for he was an old man and he was heavy. He had led Israel for 40 years. Isn't that interesting? He receives this horrible news that his sons have died, but when was it that he fell over and collapsed? When he heard that the Ark of God was gone. So now, this brings us to another interesting thing. So what happened to the Ark of God? So we're going to follow the journey of the Ark here. I'm going to make this full screen here for those of you watching online. And so we'll take a look here at what happened to the Ark here. So where did the Ark go after it was captured by the Philistines? So we're going to start here at Shiloh. That's where the Ark of the Covenant was, and the tabernacle was set up, and the worship was going on there. So from Shiloh, it's taken to this place called Ebenezer. From there, it's moved down to this city right here called Ashdod. Now, this was where a false idol, a false god, Dagon, was worshipped. And so it was placed into Dagon's temple, D-A-G-O-N. The idol fell on its face, and the head and the hands were broken off. The Ark of the Covenant was in this false place, and there was devastation that just took place in the city. According to that's just how it's described. We don't know all of the details there. So from there they said, well, we don't want this ark. Let's just take it down to Gath. So it's taken down to Gath. Panic ensued there. Not good things took place. Then it was moved on up here to Ekron. So the Ark of the Covenant was moved there. The people there demanded it be moved, and devastation fell on the city. And so the people there demanded it be moved. It was sent back to this place, Beth Shemesh. And so this now, the ark is now back in Israel territory here. So the Philistines returned the ark along with many peace offerings, because they didn't want any more of the devastation to have to do with the Ark of the Covenant being with them here. It's kind of an interesting thing here. The Levites in Beth-Shemesh placed the ark on a rock, and several Israelites in the town were struck down because they treated the ark disrespectfully. So this is again the lesson of we do God's things God's way is what God is teaching his people here. So then eventually it's taken from there to this place here, Kiriath Jearim. So this is the journey of the ark here. And so there it remained there for 20 years. Eventually it would go from here into Jerusalem. And so later on in David's ministry, you remember they brought the ark into Jerusalem. He danced in front of it. That's where it was before it came into Jerusalem. So I just found that kind of fascinating to see how to see the different places that the ark went and how that went. So that was an interesting thing that took place there. So now from here, Samuel begins to officially step in as the leader of Israel. Eli, Hophni, Phinehas, they're all dead. So Samuel is technically, then Samuel was the last judge. We looked at that time of the judges. The book of Ruth took place during the era of the judges. So Samuel was the last judge. So Samuel serves and leads Israel, but then Israel asks for a king. Now it's interesting how Samuel was very strongly influenced by Eli, trained under him, but just like his mentor Eli, Samuel's own sons, Joel and Abijah, did not follow the Lord's ways. He did not train them up. They took bribes, they perverted justice, they did not follow the Lord as they should. So, this time the judgment was different. Because Samuel's sons were unfaithful, the people of Israel demanded of Samuel that he appoint a king to follow him after his death. So they're saying, we don't want your two sons ruling over us. They can't do it. Please appoint a king, anoint a king to be over so we can kind of be like the other nations. Now, it's important to understand that God had warned the people and before this, and then he warns the people again through Samuel what having a king like the other nations would mean. It was really not God's will for the nation of Israel to have a king. So let me read here from 1 Samuel chapter 8, beginning in verse 10. I'm going to go through verse 18. Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "This is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses. They will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of fifties, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take a tenth of your grain of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants, your male and female servant, and the best of your cattle and donkey he will take for his own use. He will take a tenth of your flock, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." So there was a warning to the people that Samuel's giving. Nevertheless, the people insisted on having a king. And so that brings us to the second person in this. That's the big key in this here. The second person is Saul that we learn about, and that's chapters 9 through 15. So this is the first king of Israel. So how does this come about here? So Saul, first of all, in chapter 9, is chosen as king. I'll read a few of the verses here. 1 Samuel 9, beginning in verses 1 and 2. There was a Benjamite, a man of standing, whose name was Kish, son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Bechorath, the son of Ephraim, the son of Benjamin. Kish had a son named Saul, as handsome a young man as could be found anywhere in Israel. You know, there are some times where I can really identify with some of the people in the Bible there. No, okay, all right. Okay, you can roll your eyes at that one there. So, as handsome as a young man could be found anywhere in Israel, and he was a head taller than anyone else. So, this guy looked like a king, in a sense. They looked at, hey, this is king material here. Skipping down a few verses, 1 Samuel 9, 15 through 17. Now the day before Saul came, the Lord had revealed this to Samuel. About this time tomorrow I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin. Anoint him ruler over my people. He will deliver them from the hand of the Philistines. I have looked on my people, for their cry has reached me. When Samuel caught sight of Saul, the Lord said to him, "This is the man I spoke to you about. He will govern my people." So, God allows the people to have their way and have a king. And so Saul is chosen as king. Then Saul is anointed as king in chapter 10. I'll just read here chapter 10, verse 1. Samuel took a flask of olive oil, poured it on Saul's head, kissed him, saying, "Has not the Lord anointed you ruler over his inheritance?" And again, Israel choosing a king was Israel rejecting God's real will for him. So that brings us on down to the next thing here. We have Saul is anointed as king, and is chosen as king. He's anointed as king here. And let me just read another one here. Samuel summoned the people of Israel. This is verse 17 of chapter 10. Samuel summoned the people of Israel to the Lord at Mizpah and said to them, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought Israel up out of Egypt. I delivered you from the power of Egypt and all the kingdoms that oppressed you. But you have now rejected your God who saves you out of all your disasters and calamities. You have said, 'No, appoint a king over us.'" Samuel's making it real clear. Okay, have it your way. Have your king. So now that brings us to the next part here where Saul now reigns as king, chapters 11 and 12 of 1 Samuel. In these chapters here, Saul experiences a military victory against the Ammonites who had attacked the city of Jabesh. Saul now is fully accepted as king by the people of Israel. And I'll read here from 1 Samuel 11, 14 and 15. Then Samuel said to the people, "Come, let us go to Gilgal and there renew the kingship." So all the people went to Gilgal and made Saul king in the presence of the Lord. There they sacrificed fellowship offerings before the Lord, and Saul and all the Israelites had a great celebration. So, he has these military victories. It's not only that Samuel anoints him king, God tells him to, the people accept him as king. And so now we are in the era of the kings officially here. So then we have Samuel's farewell speech. So this is Samuel not necessarily ready to die. He is handing the reins of leadership from himself over to Saul. So even though the people were rejecting God's guidance by asking for a king, the Lord still promised blessing if they would obey him. I'll read to you from 1 Samuel 12, 14 and 15. "If you fear the Lord and serve and obey him and do not rebel against his commands, and if both you and the king who reign over you follow the Lord your God, good. But if you do not obey the Lord, and if you rebel against his commands, his hand will be against you as it was against your ancestors." And I'll highlight another verse here. This is in 1 Samuel 12, 25. "Yet if you persist in doing evil, both you and your king will perish." So Saul's reigning. He has some initial victories here, but it doesn't take too long until Saul is rejected as king. So this is chapters 13 through 15 here. So Jonathan, who is the son of Saul, one of Saul's sons, defeats the Philistines. In turn, Saul experienced victories over the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edom, Zobah, the Philistines, then the Amalekites. A lot of different military victories going on. Then Samuel instructs Saul to attack the Amalekites, and he's told that he is to totally destroy them, not take any plunder for themselves, none of the cattle, nothing like that. So 1 Samuel 15, 10 through 11, we're beginning to see the downfall of Saul. "Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel, I regret that I have made Saul king, because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions." Samuel was angry and he cried out to the Lord that night. When Saul attacked the Amalekites, he kept some of the plunder for himself and rationalized that this was the right thing for him to do. He did not obey what God was instructing him to do. And so, 1 Samuel 15, 23, "For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king." This is Samuel confronting Saul. Now again, we're going through a lot of history here. So, and then at the end of that chapter, verse 34 and 35, "Then Samuel left for Ramah, but Saul went up to his home in Gibeah of Saul. Until the day Samuel died, he did not go to see Saul again, though Samuel mourned for him, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel." So, at this point in history, Saul is still king. but kind of like that movie, Dead Man Walking. That's kind of what he is. He's king, but his days are numbered, and he knows it, and you can see it in his actions here. So we've talked about Samuel, we see Saul, and now we're going to be introduced to David, one of the key figures in all of the Bible. Abraham, David, Moses, he's right up there with all of them here. So we're going to see what happens here. First of all, in chapter 16, David is anointed king. Samuel is sent to Bethlehem, the home of Jesse. You might remember when we talked about Ruth, how Ruth from last week's study relates to all of this. It coming down to the line of David here. Samuel is sent to Bethlehem, the home of Jesse, to anoint a new king. And again, Bethlehem would also eventually be the birthplace of Jesus. So Jesse's oldest son, Eliab, was brought out before Samuel. And Samuel thought to himself, well, surely this is the guy. This has to be the king that God wants me to anoint. And here's that key verse again. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. 6 more brothers are brought out and not anointed. Finally, David, the youngest, who's out tending sheep, he was brought in, and he was identified as the one that God had chosen to succeed Saul. And so in 1 Samuel 16, 12 through 13, so he sent for him and had him brought in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and a handsome features. Again, there's so much in the Bible you can just relate to, when you read it. But all right, so then the Lord said, rise and anoint him. This is the one. So Samuel took the horn of oil, anointed him in the presence of his brothers, and from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. Samuel then went to Ramah. Meanwhile, Saul, dead man walking, became tormented in his spirit. He was just in anguish. He knew he'd messed up, and he knew things were not going to go well for him. David happened to be a musician. And so he was sent to Saul to play music for him and comfort him in his anxiety and in his depression. And it soothed Saul in his difficult and dark times. So David is anointed king. Not really been announced or anything yet, but it's been anointed. God has chosen him. So that brings us to David's training. I guess that's the best way to put it here. 1 Samuel 17 and 18. Very famous account. I won't recall the whole thing, and this is the story of David and Goliath. David is home from battle. He is back on the home front. His brothers are all at battle, and there is a man by the name of Goliath, one of the Philistines. He's a giant, and he is challenging anybody from Israel to come out and fight him, and making this challenge, and all the Israelites were shaking in their boots, and they wouldn't do it. So eventually, we know the account. David goes out and slays Goliath. He wins this mighty victory over the giant. In this point too, David and Jonathan, who was Saul's son, they began to form a strong friendship. Jonathan could see David and his character for what it was, and he could also see his own father and his father's character for what it was. And so he showed favor to David here. So now that brings us to, we see here this Saul's jealousy here. David won this great big victory over the giant. And so the women began to chant, Saul has killed his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. So the women in Israel are chanting that. You imagine that. If you're a jealous king, you know your days are numbered. That's going to make you a whole lot more paranoid. This infuriated Saul to the point where there was a time where he tried to kill David with a spear. David escaped. And very sad verse here, 1 Samuel 18:12. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David but had departed from Saul. Very, very sad verse there. Well, in the midst of this, David ends up marrying Saul's daughter, Michal. So it's a complicated tale that goes on here. I'm going to read here too in 1 Samuel 18, verse 28. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy the rest of his days. And so now the next series of events here, chapters 19 through 31 here, is the time where David is hunted by Saul. I find this interesting here. When our daughter McKenna was little, every night we would go through Bible accounts, or maybe when she was real little, we'd read these simple Bible stories. And we came across this story of David being chased by Saul, and David showing mercy to Saul, and for some reason that just fascinated her. I don't know what that was. For a long time, for several nights, she kept saying, "Can we read that story about Saul chasing David again?" And it was just something about that, and there's something interesting about the human dynamic of here that goes on. So during this time, Saul attempts to kill David multiple times. And here are some of the highlights of what happened during these chapters here. First of all, there's the covenant that with Jonathan, David makes with Jonathan here. I'm going to just read this out to you here. 1 Samuel 20, 14 through 17. This is Jonathan speaking. He says, "But show me unfailing kindness, like the Lord's kindness, as long as I live, so that I may not be killed, and do not ever cut off your kindness from my family, not even when the Lord has cut off every one of David's enemies from the face of the earth." This is Jonathan speaking to David. He knows his father's days are numbered. So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, "May the Lord call David's enemies to account." And Jonathan had David reaffirm his oath out of love for him, because he loved him as he loved himself. So you have this covenant between David and Jonathan, who was the son of Saul. That comes back to play in later on. I think next week we'll look at that. Then David gathers some fighting men. He begins to gather some people to help him as he is fleeing Saul. So while on the run, he recruits this fighting force. I like the description here. All those, this is 1 Samuel 22 and verse 2, all those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him. And he became their commander. About 400 men were with him. So he gathers his own little force here. David here begins, he wins his own battle against the Philistines. And so then we're in this time where Saul is still pursuing David, wanting to kill him. David has a little force of people around him as well. David spares Saul's life 2 times, in 1 Samuel 24 and 1 Samuel 26. There was a time when Saul came into a cave. David was there, could have killed him. There was another time Saul was in his camp. David was there, could have killed him. Both times spared his life. And both times David let Saul know what he had done. And it was interesting, even at those times, Saul at that moment had a tinge of guilt. And you could see the torment that he was going through. He showed his regret that moment, but then it turned back into paranoia again, and he continued to pursue David here. During this period as well, Samuel, he dies, the last judge of Israel, and so he is now out of the picture. And now this is an interesting thing here. David was the one who killed Goliath, the champion of the Philistines. And so there was a period of time during his running away from Saul and hiding from Saul that David hides out among the Philistines. He goes and hides out among them. He lived there for about 1 year and 4 months, and he earned their trust he earned the trust of the leaders by attacking some of the Philistines' other enemies that happened to be enemies of Israel as well. So David and all of his crew were sent away from the Philistine territory before they were in a position where they were going to have to attack Saul's army. They never attacked their own people, but for a while he hid out with the Philistines. It's quite a tale here, isn't it? So now we have another very weird and interesting account that takes place here, where Saul consults a medium. Sometime you may have heard this known as the Witch of Endor. So in desperation, Samuel's gone. He hasn't even come to visit Saul, and then Samuel dies. In desperation, Saul seeks out a medium. This was somebody who's practicing witchcraft, and he wanted to summon up Samuel from the dead and get a message from him. And you can see how twisted that their thinking had become. This practice obviously was forbidden, but there was a mystery of how this happened. I think most scholars believe that the Lord just kind of took over here and made a miracle happen, and because this medium, this witch of Endor here, was very shocked all of a sudden that Samuel spoke and actually did appear. Now how this all went here, but God was giving a message to Saul. Samuel did speak to Saul and predicted his defeat. And so when an actual quote-unquote ghost appeared, something actually happened, this witch of this medium was extremely startled. So it goes to show you that maybe that she, was, a lot of these people are just kind of frauds and just kind of making up, pretending they have supernatural powers. And so one of these interesting things, a lot of debate over what happened there. So then from there, David destroys the Amalekites. He wins a great battle there. And then Saul, finally, he dies and he meets his judgment. Saul is wounded in a battle against the Philistines. And let me just read to you the end of Saul's life, 1 Samuel 31, beginning in verse 4. Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come here and run me through and abuse me." But his armor-bearer was terrified and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul and his 3 sons and his armor-bearer and all his men died together that same day. So that brings us to the end of 1 Samuel. And then 2 Samuel, we get into the rise of David and his reign. So as we get through this, what are the lessons that we can draw out? There's many different ones. Here's just a few of them. One lesson is this, that God cares about our distress. Now, this takes us back to the beginning of the book with Hannah, who was very distressed because she wanted a child and had been unable to bear a son. And Hannah cried out to God in her distress, and God heard her. And we need to remember that God is close to the brokenhearted. And when we cry out to him, he does hear, and he does care for us. So there's a reminder there. Another reminder here is God speaks when we least expect it. There's Samuel there near the Ark of the Covenant, and all of a sudden he hears the Lord's voice, and he thinks it's Eli. And finally, God speaks to him in this way, and so I think we need to understand that sometimes God will speak or give messages to us in ways that we would least expect it, or maybe in places that we would least expect to hear something from God. One giant lesson is this: sometimes God judges us by just giving us our way, letting us have our own way. You want to do this? Okay, here it is. You want your king? Here's your king. And we'll see how this is going to go. And we can see the list of kings. It was a long, sad history with a few bright spots here and there as we go through that. Another lesson we learn here is that partial obedience is really disobedience. When Saul was told to destroy the Amalekites in that battle, and he did not Saul rationalized what he was doing. You take that word rationalize, rational and lie. You can tell yourself a lie that sounds pretty rational, and Saul had done that, and he was making up excuses, and he was obedient some, but he was partially obedient, and so partial obedience is really disobedience. And so that's a lesson that we can learn from that. And then finally, God ultimately looks at the heart. Saul was a head taller than everybody else in the nation, but that's what people thought a king ought to look like. But ultimately, God looked at the heart, and God saw something in the heart of David that would truly be a king of Israel. So I told you again that in each one of these books we will see Jesus in here. Hannah, in her prophetic prayer, made a prediction, a messianic prophecy here. But in more general terms here, we see God's redemption story unfolding here. Now we're beginning to see King David step into place as leader of Israel. From his line, family line, would eventually come Jesus. So as we work our way through the Old Testament, we are getting closer and closer to Jesus, and that gets us through the end of 1 Samuel.